All right, and welcome to our latest Showrunner webinar here inside of the Showrunner podcasting community. I am Jared Morris, and I'm very excited today to be joined by Carey Green, who is the founder of Podcast Fast Track, the host of Podcastification, and we're going to be talking today about Audacity and talking about the right way to edit podcasts with Audacity. Carey has a tutorial prepared for us to kind of walk us through how Audacity works. We'll take some questions at the end. And I'm really excited about this because, as I was telling Carey, I've never actually used Audacity myself. I've always been a GarageBand guy, dabbled a little bit in Adobe Audition. So I'm really excited to learn from him because he has a lot of extensive experience doing this. So has a lot of good insight to share. But before we dive into the nitty gritty and do the tutorial, let me just welcome our guest expert in here, Carey Green. Welcome to the Showrunner.
Thanks, Jared. Fun to be a part of this.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I did mention before we just hop in here to doing the tutorial, I mentioned Podcast Fast Track. I mentioned Podcastification, Podcast Fast Track. That's the business that you guys have, basically, helping podcasters, your podcasting service, Podcastification, your podcast. What is there any kind of basics people should know about those if they want to kind of check you out and learn more?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, Podcast Fast Track saves you from the podcast time suck. We just take care of all that back end stuff that nobody wants to do.
Is there a time suck with podcasting?
Is there? I don't know. Yeah, some people really love it. Some people are the tech heads and they just love getting into the weeds with all that stuff, and that's fine. They don't need us, but we provide audio production and show notes, and then a bunch of ancillary services for podcasters who love their podcast but hate the time suck. And then the podcast is just what we learn from working with clients about podcasting and how to do it better.
On there, sharing your knowledge, kind of like what we're doing with the Showrunner.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, we're really fortunate to have you in the community. Really fortunate to have you here today on this webinar. And maybe just as kind of an opening question here with Audacity. Why Audacity for you? There are many options that you can choose from. What do you think are the biggest pros of Audacity that people watching this, as they're kind of making this decision, why should they consider Audacity for their podcast editing?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest pro is it's free. Anybody can grab it. It's open source. In my opinion, it's not that hard to learn. There's tons of tutorials on YouTube. I even have a lot of free ones on YouTube. So there's all of that. There's also some pretty inexpensive courses you can purchase to learn Audacity as well. And the basics that you need for podcasting can all be done through Audacity. I've been editing professionally for a little over 5 years now, and that's all I use. I don't have any plugins that go with it. I don't change anything. I just use the basic Audacity tools and it works.
Do you use anything for leveling? You just said you don't, so I'm assuming you don't, but how, and maybe we'll get into this, but is it pretty easy to balance out levels and different things like that inside of Audacity?
It can be, but I guess I misspoke there. We do use Auphonic at the very end of our production process, no matter what software our editors are using. We run everything through Auphonic because it does such a great job.
Yeah. Okay. I do the same thing. It's a great program.
It really is.
Cool. Well, let's, without further ado, let's hop into this because I know you have a tutorial prepared. We want to take questions, kind of bigger general questions. Save those for the end, and you can use the Q&A box for that or the chat. I'll monitor both. If you do have kind of questions for clarification as Carey's going through, feel free to post those, and then I'll, kind of try to jump in and be the voice of the audience here if there are any questions of clarification so that we can hit those right away when they're more relevant. But with that said, Carey, I'll turn it over to you so you can share your screen and walk us through, because I'm excited to learn this.
All right. Can you see the screen there?
Yes. Yes,
okay.
We can.
Cool. All right. This is Audacity. One thing I should say about Audacity to begin with is it is known as a destructive editing tool, which means if you change something and then change something afterward and change something afterward and change something afterward, you can't go back and undo the first one unless you undo 2, 3, 4, and 5. You've got so it stacks edits upon edits. That is, in my view, the most limiting or the biggest liability of using Audacity. You have to learn the tool well, and you have to be kind of methodic about how you do your edits, so that you don't do something that you can't undo later. Audacity also is a tool that I think most people can learn pretty easily. You've got to go into editing anytime that you do editing, I think, with an editing philosophy. You've got to know what is it you're listening for? Why are you listening for that? What are you going for? For me, it has to do with clarity and comprehension. I want everything to be understood well, and I want it to be easy to listen to. So if there's things that are distracting or limiting to the comprehension of the episode, I want to take care of that in my edit. So what I've got here is a template that's, I guess, pretty much the common sort of a template. I've got an intro piece here. I've got some main tracks that I pulled in here. I've got a label track that I put in just for myself to highlight some types of edits. So you wouldn't typically have that. And then I've also got an outro down here, this audio track right here. I don't even know what that is, so I'm going to delete that. But let me zoom in. Now, one of the keys with Audacity is to go into your edit preferences right here and use your keyboard section to set up some shortcuts. Keyboard shortcuts will save your life in any editing program because you can do everything from your keyboard instead of using your mouse for all these issues. So I've got some shortcuts set up that you're going to see here. Now, one of them that's not even one you have to set up is you can hold down Control and use your scroll key on your mouse, and it'll zoom you in and out. It's just very simple. And zoom is your friend. You want to learn how to zoom in because you can make real minute detailed edits using the zoom feature. So this intro music up here, I've already set the ducking or the volume levels. That's what this swoopy line right here represents. All the way up is full volume, and down here is lower volume.
Did you set those manually, or is there
yeah, I did set those manually. It's using this tool right here. It's called the envelope tool. And you just click on the blue line at the top of a waveform, and it's going to give you a little dot like that. And you can manipulate it up or down, however you want. If you get one in place and you don't like where it is, you can just pull it out of there and it'll disappear. So that's how I did all of this. And once you get proficient with it, it works pretty quickly. So what I've done is I've placed everything in here. All of it is butted over to the left side. So it's all at the same time. If I played it all together, it would just be a jumble. So in Audacity, you can use this tool right here. It's called the time shift tool to move things around how you want them. Right now, though, I'm using what's called a multi-tool, and it will do each of these other tools when it's needed, depending on where you put your cursor on the screen. So you see it changing at various points on here. It's because I've got my multi-tool selected. So with the multi-tool selected, I'm going to hold down my Control key, and you see another tool shows up here. It's the time shift, and that enables me to move this. Oh, my phone's ringing. Sorry, guys. Forgot to turn it off. Let me turn off the volume real quick. Mm-hmm. All right, that won't happen again. All right, so you see I can move that track back and forth like so. All right, so you can adjust things as to where you want them in your sequence. Now, let me just make a comment right here. You see these big blocky sound waves right here. These are little bleeps I put in because this is from a client show, and I didn't want to incriminate anyone with the stuff they did. So I bleeped out names of people and shows and stuff like that. But I just want to play a little bit of this for you to give you an example of what we're going to be dealing with. Before I do, though, I'm going to place all my elements where I want them to be. This one is the main track of, I do know what that thing was that was in there before. So ignore that. I'm just going to pretend it's not there. This is going to go down here because it is the main track of audio for the interview.
Real quick, when you had everything stacked like that, was that just for display purposes, or was there a reason that you had everything pulled over to the left?
Was it just for what purposes? You broke
was
up
it just was it just for display purposes, or was there a reason that you had everything stacked to the left?
Well, that's how it's going to look when you import it into Audacity. Everything will be bumped to the beginning of the track.
Okay, gotcha.
Of the file. So I just wanted to demonstrate from the start.
Okay.
And by the way, if you need to know how to import things, you just go to File, Import, find your audio track, and pull it in. It's that easy. Or you can drag and drop from a window if you want to do that. Another cool thing about Audacity is you notice on every track you've got this mute and solo buttons. Mute will mute this track, but if I hit solo, it'll mute every other track. So that's very helpful because I can solo this track and this track. And even though these down here are in the same area as this, I won't hear them. So here's an example of what I just did. by pulling that main stuff over to the end of my music.
The audio is not playing, at least to
no
my
audio is
speakers.
playing. Interesting. Not sure how to.
I don't know if did anybody else hear anything? I didn't hear anything.
Probably not. Let me see if I can change that real quick.
We could see the levels.
You see it moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Jane said she couldn't hear it either.
Okay. Let me figure out. I'm going to take out my my headphones and maybe it'll pick up this way. How about this? It's probably not loud enough.
Yeah, very faint.
How's this?
There we go.
Welcome to episode 4 of co-founder and CEO of. I'm here with. Thank you so much for your time today. To kick off this podcast,
okay, so you get the idea.
Yeah.
I just moved the main content over to where it needed to go. Now I'm gonna unsolo these, and we're gonna look at some specific edits. First of all, I'm gonna get my my outro rather pulled way down here where it's supposed to go. My computer was slow there for a moment. Still is. It's kind of locked up for some reason. I have the spinning circle of death.
That's because computers wait for live demonstrations to lock up. That's
exactly right.
It's just how things go.
Okay. So here I go using my scroll and my control key, and I'm going to, and I just noticed my, my edit tracks are going to be off a little bit because I moved that, but I know where it is. I have a spoken edit here. And by what I mean by that is the client called out an edit, said, "Oh, I'm going to do that again," or whatever. And so let me let you listen to that.
Sometimes contacting.
Here, I'm going to start a little closer to where it is.
Of how we go after our business.
and it seems like you're. Sorry, I'm going to start over here. So how does your team?
Okay, so you see, she said, "So sorry, I'm going to start over here." So this section right here, we're going to want to cut. But you have to be careful. If you cut just that, it's going to bump this whole track to the left and nothing else is going to bump to the left. So the way that you get around that is you just click up here, even with where you want to cut, and you drag all the way down through all the tracks. And you see that line is what you're going to cut out. And it just hit Control X and it all is gone. Okay. So now.
How we go after our business.
So how does your team?
Okay, so her little edit is all gone. Now, to me, that's a little too spacey, so I'm going to cut out a little more. And there we go. So that spoken edit has been taken care of. Over here is a section, what I would call a judgment call edit, meaning you as an editor sometimes have to make judgment calls on is that understandable? Is that something I should edit or not? And for me, again, I'm trying to go for comprehension and clarity. So I'm going to play this and let you hear what it sounds like.
Between you and that.
It's right up here, I believe.
And what are some of your favorite conversation starters?
Let me think about that for a second.
Okay, so you see the guy's kind of stammering.
So you're at an open house or.
So, and she decided to help him out by giving him, a little prompter, the kind of thing to think about. So I'm going to take out his entire section there. And let me show you something here that you notice how his track and her track are overlapping. I noticed that, and I wanted to be careful not to cut off any of her words. So I'm going to do the Control X again to cut out all of that. And then for the section of his voice that's left, I'll just highlight it only in his track. And Control L is a silence command. So then I silence that. And so it's like I cut out his whole thing, but I didn't touch hers.
Boy, that is really quick and easy to do.
Yeah, it is. If you get those keyboard shortcuts set up, it's very simple. And of course, you have to memorize them and figure out what they are. But it's pretty simple.
Conversation starters. Say you're at an open house or.
And see, this is probably one where I could even cut out her comment.
Conversation starters.
I could probably even cut out all this, but I'm not going to, just for the sake of this whole thing. Now, let me show you another thing here. You notice in the background, he's got all this background noise going on. I don't know if he's smacking his lips or if he's banging his desk, or we can listen to one of them. I'm going to solo the track. Yeah. So he's just like chit-chatting behind her. Yeah, agreeing, whatever. I typically will cut all of that out unless it's needed for the clarity of the conversation.
Yeah.
So instead, what I'm going to do is highlight all of this behind her voice and hit that Control L again and just silence it. Okay, to me, that makes for a better listen. It's like your brain doesn't have to fight to figure out what's being said because of all this other noise that's going on. So that's an example of what I would call a judgment call edit. Over here is an issue of audio drift. And I imagine most of you have probably picked up on audio drift before. It's been happening recently with platforms like Zencaster, where they record at different bit rates. And so one of them will overlap the other or be delayed or whatever. So here's an example of audio drift. And in this case, it's manifested in a big gap between the two audio.
That kind of thing outside of that.
See, so here's like 4 seconds of silence.
And in terms of...
And so again, because Audacity has all these tracks stacked one on top of the other, you're going to need to make sure that you cut from all of the tracks at once. So I'm going to do it somewhat like that. Hit that Control X. And then again, zoom is your friend. Zoom in, see how far it really is apart. You can see your timestamps up here. So it's less than a second. I'm going to play it, see what it sounds like.
Outside of that.
And in terms of training your...
Okay, so that fixes the audio drift in this section. But usually when you have a situation where audio drift is really bad, it's going to happen again and again and again throughout the conversation. So what I do is, as I go left to right through the session, I just correct those as I go. And one of the ways you can do that, Audacity, I'll show you, for example, right here, you see how their voices are overlapping. This gets pretty problematic because you've got to pay really close attention. But you can click right here in front of his voice. You can hit Control I, which will divide the track. You see it created a little division. And then using Control and that time shift tool, I can move his track over so that now he's not being covered up by her voice.
Engage with customers and really how to run open houses.
Right, so it's twofold. One.
Okay, so that makes for a better conversation. However, I have to be aware that now down here, it's likely we're going to have some other things to adjust because of what I just did. That's one of the bummers of being a destructive editing tool, is that now I've got to pay even more attention to more things I may have just caused in the future of the track because of what I just did. But as
Carey, one question that John had was, why not sync lock the tracks when you want to make an adjustment to all tracks?
You can do that. There is a tool up here. That's a good call, John. This tool right here is called Sync Lock. Okay, and it will lock the tracks. You see these clock things here that show up. It's showing that all of those tracks are locked, and so if I were to move something, they're all going to move then. Okay, so it makes it to where in this case, for example. I would want to sync lock just some of the tracks. You can click over here, hold down Shift, I believe it is, yeah. And I do it so often I forget what keys I press. I just press them by default. I click on those and hit sync lock, and it is only going to allow me to move. Well, no, that's not working right either. See, it's moving all the tracks, and I have these pretty little clocks that showed up here. I don't use sync lock very much just because I've found that in some cases it becomes problematic because it moves something you didn't want to move or you didn't know was going to move. And so I don't use it, but I know other editors that use it all the time and find it very helpful. I guess what I would say to that, John, is if you want to learn sync lock, take the time to learn it well. That's part of my problem. I haven't learned how to use sync lock very well just because I learned a better way or a different way maybe to say it for me, something that fit my style. So sync lock is a tool that's in here and you can lock the tracks where they move all at once. Something else I wanted to point out is just a minor thing, but there was a little lip smack right here. Whether you're using Audacity or any other tool, to me, editing is not only an audio thing, it's a visual thing. I watch for things like lip smacks. And so I see this thing right here before he speaks and I figure it's a lip smack before I even get to it. And sure enough,
right. So
you hear that mouth noise or that lip smack. So I'm just going to just silence that and it's gone.
Right. So it's true.
And part of that's a pet peeve. I just personally hate hearing people's mouth noises in my earbuds. So I'm going to go on down here. This one says bump. there was a bump of some sort that happened with a desk or something. So let's listen for it.
Sort of leadership on the team, the apartment, because we're working in the city, so it's a lot of vertical apartment stuff. So we'll come to the front door and they'll show us as if we're.
See, and here's an example of how my moving things without moving this label track at the same time lost my bump. I mean, it's in here somewhere. I just don't know where it is. I'm assuming it's right down here somewhere, but it might be this guy.
In my opinion.
No, it's not. So I'm not going to waste time hunting for it, but it's an example of, where there's a sound kind of in the background. A lot of times it's the person speaking, will bump their microphone or will bump their desk. And those can be really hard to edit out because it's in the very same track that the spoken audio is. And so the best way I've found to deal with those is to use your zoom tool and go way in. I mean, even like this, when you find the bump, and by the way, on Audacity, it's going to zoom where your cursor is. Okay. So if I go over here, it's going to zoom right there. If I move my cursor over here, it's going to zoom right there. And so I'll go right in on the bump. Let's pretend that this little waveform right here is the bump. I'll go right in on it, find where the highest points of it are, and I'm going to highlight that. And then there's this cool little tool up here called Find Zero Crossings. Okay, and I could just hit Z and it would do it, but watch the ends of the portion I've selected, and you'll see them move just a little bit. And what that did is that put my edit points at the beginning and end right where the sound wave crosses the 0 decibel line. And that's going to help not have a little thump when my edit happens. Okay, so now I'm going to cut that. And what it did is it matched up a section where the left side was at 0 with where the right side was at 0. And you shouldn't hear a thump when you play that. Now, this is likely not going to sound good because it's not the actual bump, but let's. Yeah, you can't even tell what it says because I cut out part of his conversation. So anyway, let's back out and I'll find another edit here that we need to look at. It's kind of fun sometimes just to listen to the audio and this is how I do it. I just play it from left to right and I edit as I go. And it's pulling things to the left as I go. One of the ways that I edit for the sake of time that you may want to learn how to use is right up here, this little section where there's a green play button. This is called the play at speed tool, playback tool. You can adjust the speed so that you're actually listening at a higher rate. Okay, so like 1.5 time or 1.6 time. I have one editor on my team who edits at 1.9. It's just way fast for me.
Wow.
But you're listening to chipmunk voices, essentially, is what you're listening to. And it's funny because you get used to it. And after a while, you can't stand listening to podcasts at a slower speed because it sounds like they're just really draggy. But this speeds up your editing time. Now, some of the things I'd warn you about on this. There are little nuances to speech and to edits that you will miss at higher speeds, and you need to know what those are. Sometimes they are pronunciation of words. Sometimes they are little like the nuance behind how a word is spelled, if you're writing show notes from it. So you just need to be aware of those things and be willing to stop, listen to it at normal speed, and make your adjustments that way, because you'll miss some edits if you're listening at fast speed all the time. So let me give you an example of how I would use the fast speed. I'll just go over here and I've got my keyboard set up so that I can do this play at speed by holding Control and hitting my sound or my space key. So it's going to play at a faster speed here, and that's what you're going to hear.
Sales agents on our team that we call.
Okay, now we started right there with some kind of little stutter.
Sales agents on our team.
Okay, I'm going to go back and get some context.
We work with sales agents.
Okay, we work with sales people on our team. So I'm going to cut out a lot of this.
We work with sales agents.
Okay, so these two little guys I would cut out, and I'm not going to worry about cutting all the tracks at once just for demo here. So now
we work with sales agents on our team.
Okay, and so I caught that at a faster speed. Let me go back to my fast speed and I'll show you some other stuff.
We work with sales agents on our team that we call outside sales agents that are simply on the phone all day long.
Okay, here was a on the phone. So you have to decide, am I going to cut out filler words like And I am, because I think it detracts from a good conversation.
Are simply on the phone all day long, making phone calls.
Okay, and this is what I would call a restatement. He said making phone calls. So I'm going to cut out one of those, and I'm going to listen to it again to decide which one I'm going to cut out.
All day long, making phone calls and looking to interact.
It's probably going to be easier to cut this first one because the second one was kind of blended in with the rest of that sentence. So I'm going to zoom in here, find my lowest spot, highlight all of that, and cut it. One of the tendencies you'll find when you first start editing is you'll be prone to carry this all the way over to this word just because there's blank space there. I don't know what it is about the brain makes you want to take out the blank space, but don't let the blank space stay because that keeps it breathing naturally instead of crunching all the vocals together. So I'm going to cut that. Let's listen to it.
All day long, making phone calls.
All right. So he still said making. So let's see if I can get this. Sometimes you can't always get it because it's too abrupt. Okay. So I'm using my shift and my scroll to slide back and forth to the left. Okay, so this is where he says making. I'm going to take out that first one. And I know this is going to sound abrupt because you see how that sound wave is above the zero crossing right there. So I'll show you a little trick you can do sometimes. So you heard that little blip. I'm going to highlight this and go up here to effect and fade out. And I left a little bit of it right there. So I'm going to silence that and we'll see what that sounds like.
Making phone calls and looking to interact with.
So you see the little blip from my edit went away just because I faded it out. That's a little trick a lot of people don't know, but it's pretty simple to do.
Making phone calls.
So I'm going to go back to the fast play.
Making phone calls and looking to interact with buyers and sellers. Right. So that very often that's the first line. On script.
See, one of the reasons I chose this is because this guy stutters and stammers a lot. And so it's a good example of the kind of things you're going to have to edit. So I'm going to go back to slower speed and listen to this more carefully.
Making phone calls and looking to interact with buyers and sellers, right? So that very often that's the.
Okay, and this whole phrase where he said, so that, to me, it doesn't even need to be there. And then I always go back and listen to make sure I was right.
Buyers and sellers. Very often that's the first line.
Okay, so here he said that's the, so I'm going to take out one of them.
Very often that's the first.
See, and here he did it again. That's the. So I'm going to take this one out.
Very often that's the first.
Oh, but I cut off the end of often. See, so that's why you listen again after you've made your edit.
That's
because you think you have it, but you don't necessarily. So I'm going to cut it right here.
That's the first.
Okay, so go back and listen.
Very often that's the first.
See, and this is abrupt again, so I'm going to fade it down.
That's the.
Don't you want to be a professional audio editor now, seeing how minutely detailed this is?
I will say, I mean, the way that you're doing it, it makes the process look very simple. Because, I've gone through and removed ums and you-knows and using GarageBand, and maybe I just don't know the best way to do it, but it's always taken me a long time. The way that, I'm sure part of it is your experience doing it, but it seems like a very snappy, efficient process, the way that you're showing us.
Yeah, it to me, it's all about learning your system, number one. Number two, setting up keyboard shortcuts. I mean, I'm sure in GarageBand, there's a way to set up keyboard shortcuts.
Yeah.
It makes so much difference because just 2 little taps and it's done, rather than having to highlight, go hit your cut button, all that stuff. This is just the kind of stuff we do. It's tedious, but I think especially with more and more podcasts showing up in iTunes and the other directories all the time, audio quality and a good experience is going to matter more and more and more. And so good editing is an essential thing. I feel like I've probably shown you enough little minutia stuff. Let me just show you some of the basic tools that are helpful. Up here on effects, there's a few that I use on almost everything. One of those is noise reduction. These tracks, honestly, are pretty clean. There's not a lot of background noise, so I wouldn't use it on these tracks. I always do it in a case-by-case basis. But audio reduction on Audacity is not the most intuitive thing. What you do is you highlight a section of what you consider to be background noise, okay? It may not even show up on the waveform, but you can just hear this hiss in the background. And how do you know exactly where it is? Well, you solo the track and then you listen to it. And there's nothing there on this one. Do the same thing here and listen to a silent spot. There's nothing there on that one either, but I'm going to demonstrate for you how to do it just so you know how to do it. You'll highlight what you consider to be noise. You'll go up here and find your noise reduction. See, I've got it set to Control-Alt-Z as my shortcut key. And then you're going to click this button, Get Noise Profile. And what you're doing is you're telling Audacity, this part I've highlighted is what I consider to be noise. Okay, and that's what you're doing when you hit that button. It hasn't done anything to the track yet. It's just identified what you call noise. Then you're going to click over here and highlight the entire track. You're going to pull up your noise reduction thing again. And now you're going to hit OK. You can adjust various things here. Your noise reduction here, you're telling it how many decibels worth of noise reduction to do, how much sensitivity to apply, and how much to smooth it. As far as, so it's not abrupt and jerky in the way that it does it. These are the settings I usually use on most tracks. You can fine tune these a little more, but any more than this on noise reduction, and it's going to start adding some kind of distorted sounds to your audio. And so once you've got this set how you want, I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to apply that noise reduction to that track. And you see the little time bar going there. It's working the whole track right now. And I usually will do noise reduction before I even start editing a track, if I can tell it's got background noise in it. Because at some point, you're probably gonna have to do things like compression or leveling or loudness improvements. And you don't want to compress or make louder the background noise. So I get rid of it first. And that way I've dealt with the problem before I make a bigger problem. So that's noise reduction. That's one of the things that's usually used. Another thing I use quite often is compressor. Compressor is a little bit of a misunderstood term. When you compress something, it sounds like you're squeezing it down. That's true, but not really true. What a real compressor does is it detects where your highest levels are, and it detects where your lowest levels are, and it presses them together so that they're closer to each other, and then expands the whole thing, if that makes sense. So it winds up with a net effect of the track being louder. Your waveforms are going to be bigger. It's kind of an odd thing that they call it compressor in my mind. But the way you're going to do compressor is you're going to select your track that you want to compress. I've got it set up to Control-Alt-C, and it's going to pull up your dynamic range compressor. And then you can choose different options: the threshold, the noise floor, the ratio, the attack time, and the release time. These are all things you can look up in the Audacity manual to understand exactly what they are. And we don't really have time to explain them all right now. But if you want to take a screenshot, these are the settings I typically use on compressor. And then you can also choose these two options, and I will explain what these two mean. Let's start with this one that I've got ticked. It's saying compress based on peaks. So what it means is it's going to go through first and find your peak waveforms. What are the highest things? And it's going to use that as a baseline for how it's going to determine to compress the rest of the audio. I always do that just because I want, sometimes most of the time, the loudest points in your audio are fine. You're compressing because something else isn't fine. It's not loud enough. And so I want it to expand things based on that loudest point because it sounds okay. This other one, make up gain for 0 dB after compressing. What that means is after it compresses your whole file, it will then raise the entire thing to 0 dB, which is basically the top line loudness you want on anything. 0 sounds like nothing, but it's not. It's really the loudest you want it to be. I usually don't tick this because I want a little play in there between the very loudest it can be and how loud it is going to be when I'm done with it. So anyway, after I compress, I'll hit OK. It's going to do that little line again. And you'll see these waveforms will jump a little larger after compression. Sometimes a lot, sometimes not much. And you see that jumped a little louder. On this one, I probably would have done compression, especially on the guest or the host track, because her voice didn't have the same presence as the other guys and all of that. So those are tools that I use quite a lot. Leveler you can use as well. If you're using a tool like Alphonic or something like that afterward, you don't really need the leveler. I don't mess with it at all. You can also normalize. Normalizing is going to do somewhat the same thing as compression, but you use it when your two tracks are very different volumes. Like one is really loud and one is really low. That's when you would normalize. And you can, in Audacity, normalize multiple tracks. So I could click on this one and then hold down my shift and click on the next one and then go grab my normalize tool. And it will apply the normalization to both tracks. So you can do that with almost any effect in Audacity. You can add it to multiple tracks. You can add it to everything. I don't recommend adding any effect to everything because you're going to mess things up pretty quickly. I think that's probably like drinking out of a fire hose. I'd love to answer any questions if people have specifics because I want this to be as helpful as possible.
Yeah, that was great. That was really, really good, Carey. Thank you. One question that we got asked earlier was about just the source recordings here. Like, what was used for these source recordings, and what do you recommend, and what do you use for recording good source audio?
Okay, so by meaning these two tracks?
Yeah, I think he was asking about these two tracks specifically, and then I'm just asking generally what you use.
Yeah, these two main tracks were recorded using Zoom. That's what this client uses. Okay. If you're not aware of it, there are some ways to optimize audio in Zoom. I did an episode of Podcastification just a little while back. It was probably, I don't know, 103 or 102, something like that, with a guy from Zoom. And he showed me how to go through and optimize your settings for audio. So I'd recommend you check that out. I don't usually recommend Zoom as my first choice. I would rather use something like Zencaster, or there's another platform called CleanFeed. CleanFeed.net is what it is. They use the sort of what I would call double ender technology, where it records each person on their own computer and then syncs it in the cloud. So you're missing all those warbles and glitches you hear over the internet in your recording. It gets a much cleaner recording. But as I mentioned, sometimes Zencaster has that audio drift issue. So it's been a little problematic. The problem with any solution like that is that they're web browser based. And so when the browsers update, they have to figure out an update to comply with what the browser did. And they can have a little lag time trying to figure out how to comply. So that's why you get those issues like audio drift and stuff like that happening. But overall, they work 90% of the time, I would say. So always have a backup, and Zoom is a good backup. It has some pretty fair audio. And if you're using your compression and leveling and things like that, you're usually going to be able to overcome major issues you have with Zoom.
Okay, a couple questions here from Jane. So let me fire a couple of these out to you. She has a lot of breaths in her recordings. What's the best way to handle them? Just use the silent feature, like you kind of, or not the feature, but the way that you just kind of silence those out?
Yeah. Let me see if I can find a breath here. I see breaths all the time, so it wouldn't be surprising if I can just pick one out. But to answer the question while I'm trying to find one, yes, you can just cut them out. Depending on the way the person breathes, it can sound quite abrupt, and it can kind of cut off the front of their first word if you're not careful. So I think this one right here is probably a breath. Let me listen to it. So yeah. So you hear that guy, he takes his big breath. This one, I think, is one I could just highlight and cut, and we'll see how it sounds.
So there are many.
Yeah.
So what keeps you up?
So yeah, let me mute this track.
So there are many. as you know, in any.
So yeah, that one was fine. But if it's someone who speaks kind of breathy to begin with, and they kind of take a big breath and go, I don't know, you could mess up that first word. So you might want to do the opposite of what I was doing before and highlight that breath and use the effect fade in, and it will diminish the effect of that big breath so that it kind of softens it and makes it less abrasive on the ears. Because really, for me, breaths are about the listener's ears. It a lot of times will hurt your ears if someone takes a great big breath right at the beginning. So you can use a fade in instead of a fade out on a breath before a word. If it's in an opposing track, like the person who's not speaking is breathing real heavily, which I have had a lot of, especially with people who use headset mics, You'll hear the other person breathing as the other person's talking. You can just go into their track, highlight the whole thing, and use that Control L and silence it, and just get rid of it. Let me give you a little hack on that, though. You want to be really careful. I'll give you an example here. In a section like this, you can see there's noise going on in her track right here behind him. I'm usually very careful. Let me see if I can find a more dramatic example to show you. Yeah, here's a better one. Okay. You want to be very careful. Let's just pretend that this is how it looked when you got it. You want to be very careful that you don't, I'll show you an example of what not to do. Don't highlight all of this and then silence. The reason is you're silencing a section here where this person's not saying anything, and it could cause this to sound like just this deadly silence where it just suddenly you hear everything drop off, room noise, everything, and it becomes way too silent. So what I do is if I'm going to silence the entirety of an opposing track, I'll do it within the noise this person's making. So I'll click here and drag over so that I don't have any of my silenced portion outside where they're speaking. And I'm using their voice as a mask, basically, to cover up the silencing that I did. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. What about, Jane goes on, what about lawnmowers? Or something that's maybe a little bit louder, a little bit more sustaining. I mean, obviously the best medicine is prevention here, but is there anything that you can do when that happens?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on how and where that sound appears. Let's take this track for a second. Let's pretend for a moment that there is a lawnmower going in the background of this track right here. Okay. And you would see a little waveform right here, just a little irritating up and down waveform. That is the lawnmower. What I would do is if it was on a track like this and you can see that this right here is only lawnmower, I would highlight that section. I would go back to my noise reduction. I would call that my noise, using my get noise profile. I would identify that as the noise I want to get rid of. And then I would click the whole track and apply noise reduction. It's going to still have some of that lawnmower in there, but it's going to diminish it a lot. Now, one of the things you have to be careful of in that, though, is that it's likely that some of the frequencies of the sounds that lawnmower is making are also the frequencies that the human voice makes when it speaks. And so Audacity might identify some of those lawnmower noises that are actually people's voices or tones in the person's voice. And so it could affect their voice some. So after you apply an effect like that, don't just say, oh, it's good. No, go back and listen and make sure that it actually is good, because you don't want to distort the person's voice if you can help it.
And if so say you do that and then you go in and listen, and you realize it's not good. Yeah. You can edit undo, right? Like if
Control Z. Yeah. Control Z.
Yeah. Okay. Because when you started out before, when you said it's a destructive editing program. Yeah. That doesn't mean that you can't back out of a mistake if you make a mistake.
Right. It just means it's going to layer your edits one on top of another. And so if you want to back out of a mistake, Control Z is your friend. But if you want to back out of a mistake that was four times ago, you have to Control Z 4 times and undo everything you've done since then.
Yeah. Okay.
So that means you're going to have to go back and redo all those things. That's all I meant by that. So keep that in mind.
This question from Lloyd, and then Jane, I'll get to your third question as well. Lloyd says, when you're finished editing the separate tracks, do you mix and render the tracks and do additional production work before you export, or do you export and allow the export process to mix the tracks?
Yeah, good question. What he's referring to is when you go to File, Export Audio, you'll have the option to put it into an MP3 file or whatever you want. You can choose what you want. And what it will do is in Audacity, it will automatically mix all those tracks together and make them into one, usually stereo track. He's asking, do I just let it do that automatically when I export, or do I mix and render first and then add other effects or something first? Because I'm using Auphonic after the process, I usually don't mix and render first. Let me back up. I do mix and render first, but not for the reason he's asking. I'll show you why. The way to mix and render without exporting is to click on each track, hold down your Shift key, you click on each one, and then you can mix and render. I do it by Control R. and it's going to mix and render. I'll show you what it comes up with here in the very end. Wish I could fast forward this for you, Jared. But
hey, we all know what happens when you're mixing and rendering and exporting. It takes a little while.
But the reason that I do this is because the majority of the audio that we upload is mono. Okay. And you see some of these tracks, especially the music, were stereo. And so what I'm doing is I'm mixing and rendering it all into one stereo track. Then I'm going to split it into mono tracks and only export one of those. The reason we do that most of the time, there's a handful of reasons. Number one, most podcasts are not so sound rich that you need a stereo track. It's just overkill. Number two, stereo tracks take up a lot more bandwidth and storage space on your media host. So if you're paying for a plan that only allows you so many megabytes or whatever, that's a way to save on it. Thirdly, stereo tracks irritate me as a listener, because a lot of times I'm driving with one earbud in so that I can hear traffic and hear, the kid in the back seat or whatever. And I lose part of the conversation because that earbud is out of my ear. You know what I'm saying? It's not that I can't hear it. It's just, it's not as loud or whatever. So I'm going to wind up this way. I'm going to wind up with this stereo track. I'm going to go up here to this little drop down arrow and split to mono. And then I'm just going to export this one track. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm doing it, is to get a mono track as my final outputted file. I don't usually do what he was asking about, go in here to this and then compress the whole thing, all that. I just let Auphonic take care of that.
So in your show, Podcastification, that is edited this way. So if someone wants to hear what that sounds like, they could listen to your show, and that would be an example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would challenge anybody, except for some of the most attentive audio geeks, might be able to tell that my show is mono, not stereo, and that it's not got that full orbed stereo sound, because I use very little music. I use very little effects that need that stereo effect to it. So it's really not really needed, especially for human voice. You don't really need a stereo track.
So with this may be a dumb question, but just on the difference between mono and stereo. So someone's listening to your show, they can hear it in both headphones, right?
In mine, yeah. Mono you hear equally in both ears. Yeah.
Okay.
And stereo is going to be set where you'll have some sounds in one track, but not in another. You can see this on some pieces of music where I don't think you'll see it on this particular piece of music, but I'm gonna show you. Let me take off the solo button. Okay, and you see on this is a piece of music. It's basically the same in both tracks. You can see the sound wave, but in some pieces of music, you'll see this track at the bottom is a lot lower waveforms. Mm-hmm. And it's done on purpose to give a sense of presence in one ear that's not in the other, with a certain instrument or a certain voice or a certain tone, to give a bigger feeling inside your head when you're listening to it. That's really what stereo is all about. And so for human voice, you don't really need stereo.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if you were doing a show like Serial or S-Town or something like that, where you have a lot of drama and sound effects and things like that, I would bet you those are produced in stereo. And there's a reason for that. They want you to hear those effects in a certain ear or in a certain speaker or something like that.
And then this question from Jane. She says she uses a Skype call recorder, and when she looks at the two tracks, the guests is usually higher waves, but not actually louder. How do you manage that? So
Skype call recorder,
the
guest is higher, but not necessarily louder.
It has higher waves, but not louder.
Yeah. Well, if it doesn't sound louder to your ear, I would say you don't have a problem. Louder than the other person's track. But if it does sound louder to your ear, you can always either compress or normalize the opposing track, the one that's not as big of a waveform. But my be all end all, or my fix all, usually for things like that, is Auphonic. That last step, Auphonic just handles that stuff. It's amazing. Yeah. Now we also, this may be helpful too. We also use Auphonic pre-editing sometimes. If we receive a track where something went wrong with the way the host recorded it and their mic wasn't on at its normal settings or whatever. And so their voice is just this tiny little waveform.
Yeah.
You can barely hear it. We'll run that through Auphonic first before we edit a thing. And man, it's amazing the changes that will happen.
I've had to do that. It really is amazing.
It really is. It's astounding. It shocks me.
So you'll run something in Auphonic after you've mixed it with the music?
Yeah.
And even run the music through there, and you experience any noticeable distortion with the music? Because I know that's okay.
Auphonic tends to be smart enough to pick that stuff up.
Yeah, for the most part, that's been my experience too.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things that if you're serious about this, listen to the final product. And if you do hear issues, go back and do something different. Don't just leave it. And again, you got to decide how picky you're going to be on this. If you're a hobbyist podcaster, I started there myself. My first couple of podcasts were all just part-time as I'm getting these things out. So you have to make a decision. When is good enough, and stick to that for yourself until you actually have the time or the funds to outsource it.
So Jane says, why doesn't, it's a great question. Why doesn't Audacity do the things that Auphonic does? And she's asking, so what does Auphonic do? Auphonic does a lot of different things. I mean, the program has a lot of different kind of post-production features. What you're talking about and what I use is, just their leveling software, which is really, really good. And you can download it onto your desktop and you throw it in there, and it takes, maybe a minute or two, just depending on how big the track is. And it levels everything so that the volume all sounds the same, even if you have different tracks. And I have not heard anybody cite another program being better than them. So why doesn't Audacity do it? Probably,
Audacity can do it. It's just done all in separate little effects that you have to know how to use.
Yeah.
Audacity and Adobe Audition and all those are called digital audio workstations. So it's a place where you, the audio editor, can go in and choose exactly what effects and what things you want to do to your file. Auphonic is designed to be an all-in-one thing for certain things. And can you see Auphonic on my screen here?
Yes.
Jared? Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to give you an example. Here's some of my clients. Let me just show you what Auphonic looks. Oh, I clicked the wrong thing. Sorry. Got to go to edit here to show you. And by the way, Auphonic is free up to 2 hours a month, 2 hours of audio. So don't be afraid to get in here and play with it. Mm-hmm. Auphonic is going to let you come in here, and here you'll upload your file. You'll add your metadata, all that stuff. Down here's what you're asking about. Here's the audio stuff you can do with it. You can do an adaptive leveler. You can do filtering. You can do loudness normalization, which is a beautiful thing. And you can do noise and hum reduction. So some of that background lawnmower you were talking about, Auphonic will deal with, but it won't be perfect. Any kind of background noise like that is very difficult. You'd have to get into some high-end plugins like Isotope RX and stuff like that to really deal with those things effectively. So anyway, I know this isn't about Auphonic, but she asked, so I just wanted to show you.
Yeah.
I see Auphonic as like the polish or the icing on the cake at the end. It just takes care of everything that I couldn't take care of very easily using Audacity.
A couple more questions for him. We have a few more minutes if you want to present any more questions. This one you may not know the answer to, but like for me, I use a Mac. So if I was going to use Audacity, I would do it on a Mac. Do you know how big of a difference there is between the PC version and the Mac version?
They're virtually identical.
Are they?
The only differences are when you set up keyboard shortcuts. Instead of using Control whatever key, you're going to use Command whatever key. It just a minor difference.
Okay. And how long? Like, let's say that you have a half-hour interview.
Yeah.
How long will that take you to edit in Audacity from beginning to end on average? And obviously with the knowledge that you've been doing this for a long time and have all your shortcuts set up.
Sure. Yeah. If I have a template set up, which means I have that client's intro and outro already in a project, I've got the levels on it already fixed. If they've got any sound effects or transitions or things like that, I've already got them in there and set. So I'm going to do the work ahead of time to have that all set up. And then when I pull in the audio for that particular episode, if I'm using the fast play and editing using fast play, the average for a 30-minute episode is probably right at 30 minutes. But if it has technical issues or problems that are unforeseen that I'm going to have to spend more additional time on, then I'll have to dig into that and figure out how to fix those things. But when I say the 30 minutes, I'm talking about content edits. Now, one thing you may want to do, I was sliding things around here. I know some people will pull in their main tracks for the interview, say, and they'll edit that all by itself before they do anything else. And then they'll save them as waveforms or MP3 files. And then they'll import that into their template so that as they move things around and do edits, they don't have so many tracks to deal with. They just edit those two and they're good.
Okay, so one last question from Jane, and let's see if we can actually put this in here. So she said on her last episode, the guest had some serious distortion. She gave me the link, so I'm going to try and play this, and let's just see if we can hear it real quick. It should come through here. She said, listen to like 30 seconds at the start. So let me play this real quick.
Yeah, I'm not hearing it.
Okay, so that didn't come through?
No.
I'd have to do something else for it. Okay.
Maybe if you unplug your headphones and let it play through or put your headphones on your microphone.
That's not a bad idea. Okay.
Yeah, try it. See if it'll work.
Even just to get people to realize that they can support each other, like your next door neighbors, people you go with, or interacting with that.
Could you hear that?
Yeah, I could hear that.
Okay. So what could you do with that kind of distortion?
Yeah, I think I would have to listen to it, live to know for sure. But it sounds to me like one of a handful of things was happening. Either his Skype connection or whatever he was using was bad and it was garbling his voice. In that case, there's not a lot you can do about it. I would always run a file like that through Auphonic first, just to see what it does, because it may take care of some of that. It could also be that he was too close to his microphone, and you're getting this buzzing because his voice is just too loud, and it's stressing the diaphragm on the microphone. If that's the case, you can try things like compression and limiting, and there's also an effect on here. I forget what it's called because I don't use it very often, but it's called, let me find it. Clip Fix right here. And in Auphonic or Audacity, you'll know if it's a clipping issue because you'll see red on your waveforms, like right up here at the top. That means it's clipping, which means it's just too loud is what it is. Clip Fix will take care of that. It'll drop the whole file volume, so it takes care of some of that clipping. If it's there, you see clipping, then try it. See if you can get rid of that clipping that way. But in a case like that, they say garbage in, garbage out. Man, when you have a bad source file, that makes the hardest thing. So,
Boy, it really does. It really, really does. Well, Carey, you've been remarkably generous with your time. Really appreciate it. I just posted a link in the chat to your free course on Audacity. Anything that folks should know before they maybe head over and check that out if they want to learn more about Audacity?
Let me look at it. I haven't been to that page in forever. So let me look at it. Yeah, this is actually, I don't know. And actually, this course is not free. I don't know why it says free. That's funny. This course is $39, but since it said free, message me in the group and I'll send you a link and give it to you for free. So,
oh wow, that is incredibly nice.
Well,
there's
no problem
down there at the bottom.
Yeah, it's $39 for the all-in-one course right here. But
okay, and it shows down there everything that you get in it.
Yeah, definitely. So you get all this stuff, but it's like I'm trying to think here. It's like a 36 video course teaching all the basics. But again, message me through the Showrunner community and I'll give it to you for free.
Very cool. Well, Carey, this was wonderful. I definitely learned a lot. So I'm going to go check out Audacity for the Mac because there were several things that you showed that I do every single edit that you did a lot quicker. And I got immediately jealous watching you do it. And now I want to be able to do that when I'm editing. So
yeah.
I'm going to have to go in and figure that out.
Yeah. Well, you get the course free too, Jared. So grab it and learn it.
Thank you. No, I will. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any final thoughts just on Audacity, on editing as we send everybody on about their days?
No, No, nothing at all. You guys are great.
Perfect. All right, Carey, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for being here. And we'll see you inside the community.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, Carey. All right.